It was a great trip.
It was a very good trip. And now we're back, to another trip. How's that for a segue?
And it actually only took a month.
Not 40 years. So we're back with another segue to our trip throughout the wilderness. Remember, we are drawing close to the end. And because we're drawing close to the end, we are coming up against more conflicts, both internal conflicts, that is to say, among the people of Israel, but also external conflicts. As you might imagine, the nations that we are either walking through or that we are heading towards are getting a little nervous about this large group of people who are on the march. When we were just hanging out for 40 some years, or a little bit less than 40 years in the wilderness, it wasn't quite so real and threatening. Now that we're moving, they're getting nervous. And so we have the parasha of Balak, where they decide they're going to do something about this. And Balak's great idea, great suggestion is hire Bilam, right? Hire this guy, this spell slinger, who is going to come and curse the Israelites. But there's a little bit of a caveat that Balaam tries to explain to Balak. And that is, I can only say what God lets me say. And that's where we're going to pick up. We're going to take a real hard right-hand turn at a particular verse here. But I want to make sure we at least understand the overall parasha that we're in. That Balak has asked him to come and curse the Israelites. And instead, when Balaam starts talking, he ends up saying great stuff about the Israelites. And that's making Balak a little annoyed. So with that in mind, that's where we're going to pick up. Good? So we are on page 901, which is chapter 23. And we're going to pick up with verse 16. So it's chapter 23, verse 16. And the idea here is that Balaam has said nice things about Israel. Balak is really annoying and saying, I brought you here just to curse. And he says, I got to do what God tells me to do. And they're going to try again. They're going to try and say something nasty if he tries harder, right? Okay, you ready to read?
The Lord manifested himself to Balaam and put a word in his mouth, saying, return to Balak and speak thus. So he went to him and found him standing behind his offerings and the Moabite dignitaries with him. Balak asked him, what did the Lord say? And he took up his theme and said,
it's like, all right, so did you go and talk to God about maybe doing a curse? And you're going to get me some good curse going here? And he goes to open his mouth, and this is what comes out.
Up, Balak, attend. Give ear unto me, son of Zippor. God is not man to be capricious, or mortal to change his mind. Would he speak and not act, promise and not fulfill?
All right, so this is not looking good for Balak, which is, go see if you can convince God to let me curse these people rather than bless them. And it's like, God told me to tell you. God doesn't work like that. If God says these people are going to be blessed and move through on their way to the land of Israel, they're going to be blessed and move through on their way to the land of Israel. And no matter how many sacrifices you make, God's not going to say, oh, since there were 7 sacrifices rather than just 1, sure, then I'll let you. That's not the way God works. That's the way humans work.
My message was to bless. When he blesses, I cannot reverse it. No harm is in sight for Jacob, no woe in view for Israel. The Lord their God is with them, and their kings acclaim in their midst. God who freed them from Egypt is for them like the horns of a wild ox. Lo, there is no augury in Jacob, no divining in Israel. Jacob is told at once, yea, Israel, what God has planned. Lo, a people that rises like a lion, leaps up like the king of beasts, rests not until it has feasted on prey and drunk the blood of the slain.
All right. Not the message Balak was hoping.
Oh.
Okay. You ready to do a little digging here, though? Because it all seemed very straightforward. I mean, some interesting ideas, but once again, we've got a lovely translation, which is the distillation of centuries, well, millennia of commentary and hard work And we should really examine whether or not we agree with their decision. Because did anyone notice the unicorn?
No.
The horns of the wild ox?
The unicorn, yeah. The wild ox, the horn of the wild ox. Well, actually, does it say the horns of the...
Plural.
Where are we looking at
Right
there?
above 23, 22.
Right?
The horns, what does it say?
That's my question, is what does the Hebrew say? Is the word horn in verse 22? Is there a Karen in there?
No.
Nope. Ketofot re'im lo. And that phrase is translated in this particular edition as like the horns of the wild ox. Because that's what they're translating the word re'im to be, is a wild ox. Well, no, Karen, you're thinking is the rays of light and the horns, which is why you end up with Michelangelo's statue of Moses having horns, because of that particular idea. But re'im here, well, what is a re'im?
Re'im can be two things. The animal,
Mm-hmm.
but re'im is to watch. Ro'eh.
Ro'eh, right. So it can be the verb to see, but here it seems to be talking about some sort of animal, right? Because we have this whole animal parallel coming up with the lion and later on and animals of prey. And the toafot is also a little, it's not a normal phrase. It's not a normal phrase. And so there are many people who translate re'im as being a rather unique form of animal. In particular, a unicorn. Huh? So did you know there are unicorns in the Tanakh? No? Well, there's one undoubted unicorn. And then we get to this. Keep passing, and then we'll
This is the same chapter that has a talking donkey.
Exactly. Yes, this is the same chapter as the talking donkey, but we're not talking about in this a rather unusual episode, which we've covered in previous classes.
Yes.
We're talking about what appears to be used as a regular metaphorical device. You know, I took you out on eagle's wings, right? I roars like a lion, and it's got the toafot of a unicorn. Okay, that doesn't sound like it's a talking donkey level of, you know, this could be a vision. That sounds like it's a metaphor, poetic expression of an actual animal. Now, we do have an actual description of a unicorn in the Tanakh, but that's in the book of Daniel. So let's yeah.
Toafot is horn.
No, toafot is not horns.
What is it?
The good question. We're going to come back to that.
As I looked on,
What's that?
Rashi has a different explanation about Toafot.
Indeed, he does.
as I looked on, a he-goat came from the west, passing over the entire earth without touching the ground. The goat had a conspicuous horn on its forehead.
All right, Book of Daniel. We got a unicorn. I mean, it's a goat-based unicorn, which I know most Westerners are now trained to think of unicorns as being horses with horns, but unicorns as being goat or deer-like animals with horns was common for many, many centuries as well. Now, there is one problem with this unicorn being an animal as opposed to a vision. One, it's in the book of Daniel, which is almost all books visions, and therefore not necessarily meant to be referring to a literal animal. And two, Daniel goes on later in the chapter to explain to us exactly what this, in quote, unicorn means.
And the buck, the he-goat, the king of Greece, and the large horn on his forehead, that is the first king.
Right. So Daniel himself goes on to explain that his vision of a goat floating across the earth with a horn sticking out of its head is not meant to be taken as a zoological insight, but it's meant to be taken as a metaphorical vision of the kings of Greece. And the horn coming out of this is supposed to be the first of the kings of Greece. All right. So yeah, this is why the book of Daniel is not often read. Well, it's not a stretch for Daniel to interpret his own vision. It'd be a stretch for someone else to interpret Daniel's vision.
Say a horn is a king.
And Daniel is absolutely able to say that of his own vision. For the rest of us to say a horn is a king, it's a little awkward, but Daniel himself interprets this vision, meaning that he wasn't trying to say, I was at the zoo yesterday and I saw, but instead I had a vision that God gave me, and this is what it means. And any relationship between my vision and creatures living or dead is purely coincidental, right? That this is just a vision. But we do have our verse in particular translated as unicorn from a very early time.
It was God who brought him out of Egypt.
This is our verse, chapter 22 or chapter 23, verse 23. Yeah, right.
He has, as it were, the glory of a unicorn, monokeros.
That's the Greek, right? So this is from the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the translation of the Torah that was commissioned by Ptolemy way back when he took over after Alexander the Great had died. And he wanted a copy of our Torah, but he wanted to make sure that it was correct. And so he had 70 sages, each write their own translation. And when they wrote their translation, they happened to all be the same, which kind of made it a likely good translation. There's some debate of whether the Septuagint we have now is exactly the same Septuagint that they wrote. But in any event, in this verse, the Re'im is translated as a monokeros. Right? Keros meaning horn, and mono meaning one. Right? So this was the glory, and here they're reading toaphot to mean glory. It's the glory of the one-horned animal, the glory of what we in English would now translate it as being a unicorn. Right? And realize that like that whole idea seemed perfectly natural to them. Right? They were not saying unicorn and immediately thinking myth, fable, and legend. When they said unicorn, they meant a animal the same way that if I said hippopotamus or horse, you would know I was talking about an animal that I believed existed in the world, not an animal that was just in fancy and fables. So when the Septuagint was translated, they seemed to think that there were things called unicorns.
You say unicorn, now that I see it's one horn.
Right.
Wouldn't it be unicorn? Not, no, I'm serious. This time I'm serious.
I believe that the unicorn comes from the Latin, I think, isn't it? And that in Latin, the corn works for that word. And yes, it's different in English, but in Latin, that's the way it works. As the same way we're going to find out as well that the keros is more similar to a word you already know than it currently seems like. But we're going to have to get back to that. All right. So, and by the way, this phrase of the Re'im, the 9 other times that it shows up in the Tanakh, is translated throughout the Septuagint as monokeros. Right? So they're consistent. Every time it says Re'im, it is translated as unicorn. How do we feel about having unicorns in the Bible? Well, what do we know about the unicorn from this?
According to this, it would be a goat with one horn.
Well, from the Daniel, it'd be a goat with one horn, but
As they describe its fighting and its looks, it sounds like a rhinoceros.
sounds like a rhinoceros. So what you're saying is we don't actually know much about a unicorn from just these verses.
It's a generic one piece.
It's an animal with one horn.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to hold on to, because when we think of unicorn as being good modern, prodigies of Western civilization and all of the fables of, Hansel and Gretel and everything else, when we hear the phrase unicorn, we immediately think of a magical, shimmering white horse and the horn and maidens and all of that stuff. There's no reason to believe that when they said one-horned animal, they meant that. They meant, apparently, from the Septuagint, a one-horned animal that was rather impressive, that had some glory to it, but not necessarily an actual mythical creature. Nothing magic or fanciful about it. It was just it had one horn, and that seemed to be perfectly normal to them. All right, so put on hold what you think of when you say unicorn. We're going to still just use it because it's the easiest word to use. But others chime in as well about how well people believe that unicorns actually existed and what they might have meant by that.
And in our days, one re'im was brought to the land of Portugal from the Indian island. It is bigger than the elephant, armed with scales over its entire hide, and with a thick, visible horn on its nose, with which it fights its battles with the elephant and with other animals.
All right, so forget the word unicorn just for a second. If I describe that animal to you, and you look through your big book of world animals, what might you land on? The rhinoceros, right? The rhinoceros. Keros, the nose horn, right? Rhino from nose and keros from horn. That's where the word rhinoceros comes from. It comes from monokeros, is one horn. Rhinoceros is nose horn. It's a rhinoceros. So yeah, now we know, right? Rhinoplasty is like the plastic surgery for doing nose jobs, and a rhinoceros is someone in desperate need of a nose job. So back in the 1500s, the word re'im was used by one of our Jewish scholars to describe this animal that he saw pictures of that had been brought to Europe. And this was his description. And almost certainly, it was what we would call a rhinoceros. But we have another corroborating source, this time from outside the Jewish tradition.
Oh, in the country are many wild elephants and unicorns, which are scarcely smaller than elephants. Their hide resembles that of the buffalo, and their feet are similar to an elephant. In the middle of the forehead, they have a single horn. But with this weapon, they do not injure those whom they attack. Their mode of assault is to trample upon the person and then lacerate him with the tongue. Their head is like that of a wild boar, and they carry it low towards the ground. They take delight in muddy pools and are filthy in their habits. They are not of that description of animals which suffer themselves to be taken by maidens, as our people suppose, but are quite different from how we had imagined them.
Taken from?
The travels of Marco Polo.
Right, so Marco Polo, as he was going through the middle of Asia, he sees these things and hears about their habits and what they are like. And what do you think he's looking at? A rhinoceros, right? So he's looking at a rhinoceros and he's saying, that's a unicorn. That's not what I thought unicorns looked like. And he writes that, yes, there are such things as unicorns, but they're not at all what people think of when they think of unicorns. That didn't stop people from thinking of unicorns as what they thought of as being unicorns, but he was correcting. One of the main sources for the idea that there were such things as unicorns is the translation of the Bible into Greek that had the word monokeros, that had the word unicorn. So when that got translated into Latin and they made it unicorn, 9 times in the Bible they see that there are unicorns. People thought there were these things called unicorns, and now Marco Polo, coming on and visited in India, is noticing that the Indian rhinoceros is indeed a unicorn, but it's not what they had imagined a unicorn was being. So does this mean then that when the Bible said re'im, it meant a rhinoceros? That God is saying here, back in our verse, and God who freed them from Egypt is for them like the glory of the rhinoceros. Wow, speaking of the rhino on the roof.
The elephant on the roof.
Tap twice if it's no. Once. Right, so does that sound right? Right, is that a logical way to work? That's not how logic works. I mean, that's how logic fails, but that's not how logic is meant to work. All right, so follow the path that we have here. We have the phrase re'im used in the Hebrew, and that is translated in the Septuagint into a one-horned beast. That one-horned beast becomes unicorn in the Latin versions, or just one-horned in the Greek that still persists. And that means that there develops an idea that there are out there one-horned animals. Europeans look around and they say, well, what animals have horns? And then they imagine them with one horn. Then you have people like Marco Polo and other explorers going out into the rest of the world, not in Europe, which is surprisingly rhino-free, and discovering that there are indeed animals out there with only one horn. They're just big, scary, and look almost like small elephants, or even bigger than, they get a little confused on the sizing here. And that, they say, that is what a unicorn is. Does that mean that the original author of the Torah meant rhinoceros when the author said re'im? No. Right? What happens is you have a word that's created, translated, perhaps wrong, or perhaps with something in mind that isn't a rhino, but that later, as people are hunting for what this could mean and develop their own conceptions, gets applied to a rhino. Any relationship between the author's original intent and the Marco Polo version is purely coincidental, which means we do not have to write in rhino into all of our copies of the Bible, at least not yet, because there are other options. Okay, so let's keep working.
The word tophot is equivalent to double, twice as much. God's protection for his people has been demonstrated to be at least twice as strong as the strength of the Re'im.
All right, so now one thing at least we get from Da'at Zekenim here is the idea that the Re'im is strong, right? So we're not going to be looking for some weak little animal. It's not going to be a mouse with a horn. It's a strong animal. Keep going.
Bilam likens God to the Re'im, just as the prophet Hosea likens God's roaring to that of the lion. And the prophet Amos also compared God to a lion as inspiring fear and dread.
All right, so also in Da'at Zekenim's mind, the Re'im is something that if you were to see it, you would be really impressed, right? I mean, impressed as you would be if you were to see a real lion. And not just, a lion in a picture book or in a zoo, but a lion there in front of you, or watching a lion doing lion things. You'd be like, whoa, I'm just going to walk away really slowly and get out of here. So too, if you see a Re'im, according to the Da'at Zekenim, you would be impressed by God's strength and majesty using that, just making sure we're not. Yeah, we're okay. Okay, so let's keep digging.
Although there is no known animal nowadays that is called a Re'im, the Torah uses the mythical animal as an example of this creature possessing strong horns. People in Moses' time were still familiar with that species.
All right, so what do we do with Chizkuni here? Is he saying mythical in the way we mean mythical? Like, only found in fancy and fable? Not exactly, because he says that the people in Moses' time were familiar with it. So hold on a second. So we got a powerful animal. And we've got something that is semi-mythical, meaning that it was around maybe, but now it's not. Right?
Extinct.
Well, extinct perhaps might be what they're saying, but certainly he says people at his time would have been familiar with it, whereas people in his own time were not. So we got a powerful animal, possibly semi-mythical, possibly extinct. It sounds like it's got, well, the Septuagint says one horn, but other people seem to be saying maybe more than one horn. All right, little clues, little pieces. Onward.
And Re'imim shall come down with them, and the steers with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness.
All right. Taken from Isaiah, where the word Re'im comes in again. Again, if you were reading this in the Septuagint, you'd be reading unicorns were coming down in this passage. But Re'im is Re'imim, the plural, is what's used here. But notice the company they keep.
Steers and bulls.
Right? Bulls and steers. But we have good Hebrew words for cows and for oxen, and it's not Re'im, right? So, well, okay, let's see. We've got a little more. Maybe Deuteronomy will help us.
His firstborn ox, grandeur is his, and his horns are like the horns of a Re'im.
Notice plural, right? So apparently, at least Deuteronomy thinks that a Re'im can have more than one horn. So maybe the Septuagint, when it said one horn, wasn't speaking about the absolute maximum number of horns on this animal.
With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are the myriads of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh.
All right, so what do we know about the Re'im here? What's it good for? Well, it's a weapon, right? It is fierce. It is pushy. Just to use an abbreviation, right? But its strength seems to be in its its pushingness, right? And the horns are used almost like a, you know, what's that? Like a bumper. Excellent example. All right, so we're getting a picture here, maybe? Anyone want to, you know, come up and do Pictionary of what they think the ream is? All right, one more text, and then I'm going to give you what I think is the best guess and why this translation isn't bad, but it misses the spin.
Would the Na'im be willing to serve you? Would he stay at your feeding trough? Can you bind the Na'im with ropes to the furrow? Will he level the valleys after you? Would you trust him because his strength is great? And would you leave your labor to him? Would you believe in him to bring home your seed and gather it into your barn?
All right. So the book of Job, which is one of the best places to find out about animals because it's just filled with animal style poetry and imagery, seems to be describing here the re'im as something that you might think would be good for farm work, but it isn't good for farm work, right? Think about it. He's saying, do you think the re'im would be willing to serve you the way your cows do, right? Would it stay at your feeding trough, or is it going to wander off, right? Can you bind it with ropes to the furrow? Is this a good plow animal that would work? Well, if it was a rhinoceros, would anyone think of hooking up a rhino to a plow? No, it's just not going to happen, right? But there is an animal that meets all of these criteria, and especially this one, that absolutely a person looking at it would say, you know, I wonder if we could hook that to the plow. I wonder if that would pull the wagon. The aurochs.
Yeah.
The aurochs. I know, we don't talk about them because they've been extinct since around the year 1500, depending upon where you were in Europe. But all across Asia and all across Europe, these were giant cows.
No, they were
Bigger.
bigger.
Think like your biggest Texas steer ever, you know, the longhorn kind of thing, and then put it on steroids. These are the ancestors of modern cows, in fact, you know, parallel evolution. And they were huge and wild, and they were often used in the worship of many other pagan cults because it was a symbol of unbridled strength. These things would stand 6-7 foot at the shoulder. And they had these enormous horns that were forward sweeping and terrifying, but also untamable, right? We domesticated cows and we domesticated oxen. We never domesticated these things. And that's one reason why they're extinct, because we turned land into pasture and we made it more human and domestic animal friendly. And they had less and less of an environment to shamble around in. But they would have been readily visible and known by all of the ancient cultures. And if you were to say re'im means these aurochs, then you would say, wow, God took them out with the power of the aurochs. That's power, right? That is strength.
How do you spell orc?
I'm going to do my best. I was trying to remember.
All I can think of is that.
I believe it's like that. Aurochs. And everyone goes, oh, one of them. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can bring up a quick picture. Hold on. I even spelled it right. Yes.
That's impressive.
Come on. Give me the picture. That's a skeleton. That doesn't really, well, that gives you some idea of scale. Right? So
Very interesting.
something
Yeah.
like that.
You see it next to a person, see how big it is.
Wow.
This is not Bessie down on the farm.
Yeah. Doesn't even help to have a cape. Try to put that.
It's a big cow.
Yeah.
That's a big cow.
I think we need a bigger arena.
And they have, plenty of skeletons of them. And in fact, if you go to many good natural history museums, you'll find these skeletons of the aurochs. And like I said, they were around all the way in pockets until the Middle Ages, but they used to be very plentiful all throughout Europe and Asia. And they fit very nicely all the instances of Re'im throughout the Bible as being the symbol of strength and might, of having impressive horns, maybe not just one horn, although they were very symmetrical in their horns, meaning that if you looked at them from the side, it would look like one horn because they were overlapped. And it fits the text very nicely. So the wild ox, I think, is close. Sorry for the roofers. They sound like a herd on the roof.
Yeah.
The wild ox, I think, is close, but it misses that little bit of a twist that we're not talking about just a routine domesticated animal that's now wild, because oxen technically aren't. This is something that was bigger than what we're used to, and something that would have had an even larger impact on the poetry of the time. That's it. Re'im. That's not just a cow. Make sense? Okay. But the meaning of it goes further than just trying to identify the taxonomy. And so I wanted to make sure in our second half that we look through some of the reasons why we might talk about this animal. And so Sforno gives us why would God use this comparison?
God acts like a Re'im and not a lion, a predator on behalf of Israel. It only pushes with its horns like a Re'im, that is, while it wants to expel the nations living in the land of Canaan. It is not bent on killing the inhabitants unless they resist occupation. All of this because God is not interested in the death of people. Thus the sages said in the Jerusalem Talmud, Joshua sent 3 letters to each nation of Canaan, offering them choices. 1, anyone wishing to emigrate will not be harmed. 2, anyone wishing to surrender is welcome to do so. 3, anyone wishing to resist us by fighting us is welcome to do so. The people of Canaan were obstinate, attacking the incoming Israelites, so that the latter were forced to kill them. It is clear, therefore, that the Jewish nation did not behave at all in the manner a lion behaves when it looks for prey. Instead, they acted in a manner of a Re'im when it feels forced to resist opposition.
Make a difference in reading? Because all of us, when we were reading, when we got to that verse 24 at the end of this section of Bilam's prophecy, and it had the phrase that, for lo, a people that rises like a lion, leaps up like the king of beasts, rest not till it has feasted on prey and drunk the blood of the slain.
That's not us.
That felt a little uncomfortable. It felt a little bloodthirsty. And Sforno, I think, very nicely says, if you look at Re'im and the lion as being part of an ongoing metaphor, then it makes sense. That what God is saying is that God took us out like the Re'im. God pushed, to clear a way for us. And God, if you've ever been around these types of animals, cows, horses, or other, it's not about attacking and rending. It's about just pushing things they don't like out of the way. If you've ever been with a horse in particular, you'll know that horses just love leaning to make themselves felt. And that the fighting was always the last resort. And so therefore, the idea that the nation rises like a lion, that is in response to the necessity of having to fight. But that the first, foremost, and the preferred method of dealing with this is just push, right? This is what's happening, and you can leave, you can accept, or you can fight, but it's happening. And if you choose one of the 3, then it's going to get bloody. But that's not the preference. That is not the intention. That is not the plan. The plan is simply to make room that the Israelites would be able to live in their home once more. And we didn't come looking for a fight, and God did not desire the death of those who were standing in the way.
Sounds pretty current, actually, to what's going on.
It's amazing how often
Yes.
the teachings of our classic sages are eternal.
Yes.
They are ever applicable.
Yes.
And those should always be the 3 options. There can be, peace. There can be those who wish to leave and those who wish to fight, but don't be surprised when those who wish to fight are met with resistance, because the action that's here is as unstoppable as a re'im. And you could imagine in the minds of the ancients, if anyone said, "Oh, look, there's a re'im walking towards town. Go stop him." You go stop him. It's like, what am I going to do? Put a rope around its neck? Oh, it's just drag you along. It's, you know, it's a symbol of an unstoppable force, but a non-violent, non-predatory force. It's not out for blood. It's just doing what it knows it needs to do. And that image, I think, is a very powerful one, and one that gets lost if you just think of it as being a unicorn, or if you think of it as even any other form of just casual cow. Okay, casual cow. Now, what did the re'im look like, though? Well, let's see if we can push the extreme.
Rabbi Bar Chana said, "I myself saw a young re'im one day old, and it was the size of Mount Tabor." And how big is Mount Tabor?
Yeah.
40 parsecs, 80 miles.
So 80-mile big super cow.
The length of its neck was 3 parsangs. The resting place for its head was 1 parsang and a half. It excreted dung and dammed up the Jordan.
Okay, that's a load of malarkey. Is this the Paul Bunyan version? Right, of Babe, you know, the big blue ox. That's not, am I the only one who knows the Paul Bunyan stories? Okay, you're looking at me with blank expressions, right? So we got an 80-mile big baby cow.
The neck that's 6 miles long.
Now, Rabbi Bar Chana said, "I saw this myself." He's not saying metaphorically, it seems, but nevertheless, that is exactly how the Vilna Gaon took it to be. The Vilna Gaon from more recent and modern history was in Lithuania, one of the great authors of the beginning of the Enlightenment period, and he read Rabbi Bar Chana as not speaking literally about an 80-mile wide cow.
Or maybe he was a little on something, a little high.
No, he was on to something.
He was on to something.
But it was a very coded description of a particular situation. And let's see how the Vilna Gaon unraveled this.
The Gaon of Vilna explained that this is a parable for an over-conceited young Torah scholar, metaphorically described as possessing the horns of a re'im for fighting the intellectual battles of Torah study.
All right, so how are we going to go into these details? Keep going.
He is compared to Mount Tabor, which the Midrash elsewhere describes, arrogantly wanting to be the place on which the Torah would be given due to its being far larger than Mount Sinai.
All right, so why Mount Tabor? Because in the Midrash, there's a discussion of how Mount Tabor thought it should be the place the Torah would be given. Why Sinai? Sinai's a piddling little hill, right? It's nothing. And Tabor was thinking, I should be the place for Torah to be given because I am so much greater. Do you see the arrogance of someone? Why should I listen to the Torah coming from this guy? You know, he's some old guy who doesn't really understand. He's past his prime. He's just waffling. I'm the real one. Torah should come through me, right? Onward.
And the size of 40 parsang corresponds to the last 40 years of a person's life, following his attaining 30 years of strength, and alludes to this student's imagining that he has traveled the full route through maturity.
So even though he's young, he thinks he's 40 parsangs big, right? I already know it all, right? I have already been there and done that 40 years after reaching maturity of attaining greatness. And so it doesn't matter that I'm young, I am really as big as anybody else here, no matter what experience in life you've had. I know what I've got, right? The young Turks, we know sometimes that's the attitude, right? Fresh out of college, grad school, step into a professional life, and they think that they're going to throw open the world because everybody who's come before them didn't know anything at all. You know, like you said, it's been going around for some time. The teachings of our sages are still applicable.
His head is in the clouds, which are 3 parsangs above the ground. This is alluded to with the statement that the young Re'im's neck was 3 parsangs long.
Again, in case you're wondering, why do we have to know how far of its neck was? Because there's a rabbinic idea that between the ground and the sky is 3 parsangs. And so how long was its neck? 3 parsangs. So that meant its head was in the cloud. Keep going.
The description of the resting place of his head being 1.5 parsangs alludes to the distance from the edge of the wilderness encampment to Moses' tent at the center, where this person imagines that his status lies.
Right. So the resting place is 1.5. Is the idea was that the full encampment of the Israelites in the wilderness was 3 parsangs across. So if anybody does basic geometry, you half your diameter and you get 1.5 out of 3. And that was, he thought he belonged in the middle, but he was actually at the edge. Right? So he was at the edge thinking he was as good as Moses, who was there in the center. Make sense? Ish?
But he never receives the honor that he imagines himself to deserve. And so he responds by trying to destroy the reputation of others. This is represented by his obstructing the flow of the Jordan with his excrement.
Right, well, if I'm not going to get, the respect I deserve, then I'm just going to sit around sniping at people and being snotty and snarky and critical and really rude and just putting people down because you don't recognize how great I am, even though that's going to basically block up the flow of the river. It's going to block up, the flow of the water, which is what we all need. So he may think he's all great, but he's not getting the respect, and so instead he's all over everyone else.
Yeah, I would have thought the Vilna Gaon would have been a lot nicer in his criticism of this.
Well, remember, it's the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon
is
saying that Rabba Bar Bar Chana used this as a metaphor for someone else in Rabba Bar Bar Chana's time.
He's not criticizing.
Right. So Rabba Bar Bar Chana, rather than saying, "Have you seen this young jerk?" said, "You know what? I've seen a re'im that was 40 parsangs long, as big as Mount Tabor," right? Which, of course, 40, and is only 1 day old. And basically, he was tearing down some other guy who was acting obnoxiously. But rather than just saying he's young, he's inexperienced, he's rude, he has no respect for it, he instead built this lovely metaphor about this not so lovely young man, and left that as a more poetic description of what this person was like.
But we're using this because the word re'im happens to appear, and so we're using it to try and describe to ourselves what a re'im might be.
Exactly. And again, when you add in the idea that a re'im is one of these wild, untamable, undomesticated, and unusable bulls, then you have another picture of what Rabba Bar Chana is trying to say about this young man. Is that, an ox knows how to pull the plow and do work and produce something. A re'im doesn't, right? A re'im just stamps around and looks impressive. And that's what this guy is.
So
right?
when we go back to our original Parashat Balak,
right,
we are not to see the re'im as this 80 parsang long.
He's not 40 miles wide.
Not 40 miles.
He impressive enough that he would stand up to about here, right?
Still in, okay.
And that's one of the things, is that sometimes the rabbis will use in the midrashim animals or descriptions that seem wild, that seem like fairy tales. And more often than not, when they use them like that, they're not using them like that because they believed it to be literally true. They didn't literally believe that there was an 80-mile wide baby cow, because if there were, the mother's womb would have had to have been 80 miles, which meant she would have had to have been hundreds of miles. And the rabbis knew that that didn't happen, or else someone else might have also noticed. Did you see that cow walk by and block out the sun? Right? Every time it moved, it shook the entire earth. But they often will couch the language of their teachings in these parables and this hyperbole for good rhetorical effect, because I can rest assured that all of you will remember better the image of some young-nosed, wet behind the ear kid who's just trouncing around like a newborn cow, dropping everywhere, is much more memorable than just describing the person in the normal prosaic manner. Right? This is a much more powerful image. And that comes back to why are the visions so often in the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh given in poetry and given in these almost larger than life ways. And it's because it is more powerful to the emotion, and it does help us remember, and it does help us feel a level of inspiration that we wouldn't get if Balaam had just said to Balak, God says that the Israelites are going to do okay and you're not. Would not have had the same impact on us. But to say God took them out like with the glory of Re'im, you know what? Now I'm a little stirred. Now I've got some passion in me that came from these words. So thank you for indulging me on our little zoological expedition. And hopefully you found that as interesting as I did when I was looking up on this of what exactly is a Re'im. Well, maybe we'll do some more from time to time.
This metaphor remind you of the conversation we had earlier?
Very much.